This is timeline number 8, French Rev. This is one of those things we hit really hard in class, so hopefully a lot of this stuff is familiar to you, but based on my last class, a lot of this stuff went over their head, which means we need to talk quite a bit about the French Rev. First and foremost, above all else, our cluster box for the French Rev is a big, bold triangle with not one X, but two X's through it, because the ultimate point of all of this that we've had has been leading up to the French Revolution. The French Revolution has an actual labeled key concept feudal system called the Old Regime with the estates, a formalized version of this feudal system, and the French Rev is going to annihilate it. That is the key of everything that the French Rev is doing, is ultimately destroying this feudal system. The other thing, we're not going to put 1,000 things in the cluster box for this, but we are going to write the Enlightenment. If you ever write an essay, short answer, DBQ, about the Enlightenment, your context or what part of your discussion will be the French Rev. If you answer any questions about the French Revolution, the lead up to it will be the Enlightenment. They are linked greatly. Okay, so it's the effects of the Enlightenment is what we're seeing. You could also throw in things like humanism, secularism. You could throw in civic humanism would be a great point here, because we're going to be talking about elections and democracy and everything else of the sort. Over here, not quite at the very end, let's put 1800, 1700, and then start with 1600 over here. We need all that on the timeline. Now, our gold star question is, what ends all of this? It's not an Uber date, but it's a date I've said enough and I'd hope you'll recognize, okay? The French Rev is going to have, we start with an absolute monarch and the nobles and the clergy. We're going to overthrow them, create a democracy. We're going to go radical and go crazy. The end of this is what, man? Napoleon. Napoleon takes over all of Europe, and when he collapses, yes? Metternich, which leads the 1815 Congress of Vienna. This is the return to conservatism. This is the destruction of that liberal hippie Napoleon and all the other democracy of the French Rev. All right, so that's our end goal. The Congress of Vienna, like I said, not an Uber date. It's not 1517, 1789, or 1871, but it's kind of like 1715, that death of Louis XIV. Let's put that on here too. Right? It's not a coincidence that the greatest absolute monarch in all of history dies, and about 50 to 60 years later, his country is ready for revolution. Even though he does not represent democracy or freedom or individual choice at all, the fact is the economy grows, the military has success, all under Louis XIV, and you can get away being a dictator as long as people are like that. But to start, our first color up here will be the causes. The causes of the French Rev. And in order to start with the causes of the French Rev, we are going to talk about the estate system. Now, the feudal system for France, like I said, it has a key concept name. Sometimes it's called the Ancien Regime, which just looks like ancient regime. It's also referred to as the Old Regime. The Old Regime. That's the formal title for the French feudal system. And it means it has 3 estates. The first estate is who? You always screw this up. And so do I. The first estate is the clergy. The clergy or the church, specifically the Roman Catholic Church. They're the only ones with formal power, with formal control, because ever since the Edict of Nantes was revoked, they're the only guys with real power in the country. The second estate is the nobles. They're about 3 or 4 times the size of the clergy, but again, these are the old-timey nobles, the big old fat guys that live in a castle with a pile of gold in the basement. They lost a lot of their power under Louis XIV, but they didn't complain that much because they were richer and they were happier. But since he's dead and the country starts to tank, right? What's a big sign that France is tanking? About 1756 to 1763 was the 7 Years' War, right? The 7 Years' War that they have to pay back. That costs a lot of money and they don't get anything. The third estate is who? Everyone else. Yes, and to be clear there, the third estate is everyone else. "200 years before this, the third estate was who? No. 200 years, 300 years before this, in the real feudal system, in the Middle Ages, I should say, it's peasants, okay? It was peasants, all right? there was technically merchants and tradesmen, but they make up like 0.1% of the population, right? When we lived in an agrarian society, all of that third estate were peasant farmers. They were rednecks that live in the countryside. That's significant because rednecks that live in the countryside don't throw revolutions. They just live in the countryside and they die alone, all right? Even though their lives are worse than the people today, or at this time in the 1700s, they are not rioting because they are so spread out. What is the biggest change that's happened to this third estate, that's happened to society? What's the biggest change from the 1600s into the 1700s that we see? No. Urbanization. The biggest change is people live in the city. For that reason, we're not going to put them on the timeline, but do you remember the name of the urban poor in France at this time? They didn't wear the big old tall socks. They were called sans-culottes. The urban poor from this point in history are going to be the ones who lead the revolution. The urban poor live in the city. They can read newspapers and pamphlets. They can see the impact the government has, both the positive and the negative. And they are the first to starve because they don't grow their own food. They have to buy it. Who else is included in everyone else, Carson, at this time? The new elites, okay? We'll give them the name of bourgeoisie here, but these are the people who work 9 to 5. Doctors, lawyers, teachers are not, even though they're wealthy, all right, ish at this time, they are not included in the nobles, and there is actual political power in these groups. Being in the first and second estate gives you significantly more power than the other estate, mostly because of the makeup of the Estates General, the Parliament, the Congress of France, the way the voting works, you want to be in the nobility or everywhere else, okay? Some of everyone else has jumped up to become nobles, right? Let's put them here. Let's put new elite. We know that they got power because of what? Banking and merchants. And the other point we'll note is as some of these people jump up, we can almost put them in the nobles. The new-timey nobles are the nobles of the robe. For this class, what's the most common job the nobles of the robe are going to take? An intendant. They're a rich, wealthy, learned person, right, that are going to work for the king in exchange for earning that noble title and giving them some power. These are the newer rich people, the newer nobles. We would call them liberal nobles looking at history because they understand, even though they're benefiting from the system is broken. The last thing we're going to put somewhere in the middle down here, give me all this space up, as much of this space up here as you can. So a couple other causes that we're going to put in here. We'll put again a financial crisis. Again, we've talked about this, right? Louis XIV never calls the Estates General. You can get away with never calling your governing body as long as you don't do what? Raise taxes. As long as people are wealthy, can buy more stuff, and can afford food, even the nobles don't complain about not getting to exercise their legislative power. But as soon as you hit times of strife, you need the support, the laws, the taxes of that Estates General in order to get things done, in order to make tough decisions. And what sparks this financial crisis? Write it again, the 7 Years' War. 7 Years' War is a deadly, but more importantly to history, expensive war. It's a colonial war, a world war. There's a reason we call it the French and Indian War, and Europe calls it the 7 Years' War. It's that broad. England, though they win, though they come out on top in the 7 Years' War, they still have a huge debt from fighting this war. What does England do? They tax the colonies, right? Which will spark the American Revolution, no taxation without representation. But France, since they didn't win, they don't have as extensive or as wealthy of colonies, so they need to tax where? France. They need to tax France. The problem that they run into is that with the Estates General, they're only ever going to raise taxes on the third estate. But 95% of the wealth is in the nobility and the clergy. To functionally fix their system, to pay off this debt, they have to raise taxes on the upper class, and they just don't, because the upper class votes it down every time. The final thing that helps sparks all of this is there is a bad harvest. There's a bad harvest in the middle to late 1780s that will spark this revolution. Because people get hungrier, they get angrier. What is the event we generally consider as the start of the revolution? the Bastille. Not technically the start. Next color if you want. Now, there are three phases. The way the College Board divides this up, there's three phases of the French Revolution. The first phase is also known, they will call it as the liberal phase. The liberal phase of the French Revolution, okay? There's a second phase and a third phase, okay? The last phase is named after who? It'll be the Napoleonic phase. Do you know what that middle phase is? After the liberal phase, that's what's in it. They'll call it the radical phase. Good. So right now, the liberal phase. For the rest of the space up here, okay, you're basically split it into three sections. As wide as you can, split it into three sections. I won't put it to match because I'm going to need to erase so that I can fit. But that first third, okay, they're all right here about 1789. We can write Bastille down here as the general start to it all, July 14th of 1789. But this is our first, and right again, liberal phase. Now, the reason they're the liberal phase and not the radical phase is they want a better society, a more enlightened society. They want to change the system, but they don't want to completely overhaul the system. The best way to put it is, what kind of government are these early reformers going to want? A constitutional monarchy. A constitutional monarchy for this time is a relatively good, moderately liberal government. It's what England has, right? We still have the stability of a monarch to make decisions and lead the country, but there is a constitution. There's a written set of laws that the king has to follow, that even the king isn't above. And most importantly in those laws, it has to respect the governing body. Now, if you remember the story of the start of this revolution, the king in May of 1789, because of the debt from the 7 Years' War and other wars like the American Revolution, because of the bad harvest, was creating food prices skyrocketing in France, especially those in Paris were suffering. He finally bangs the gavel and opens up the Estates General for the first time in over 100 years and says, hey, I need you to approve new taxes so that we can pay off the debt. I read you his speech on the opening day, remember? And ultimately, he says in his speech, listen, the richest of the rich have to pay something or this society can't dig out of this hole. In the modern age, we have to tax that top 90 to 95%. And the Estates General votes no to everything. For days and then weeks and then a month, they vote no to everything. And after about a month of this chaos, of them just banging their head against the wall, a priest named Abbe Saillet releases a document, a pamphlet called What is the Third Estate? We read a little bit of What is the Third Estate, or I read it to you. And in it, he says, listen, look at what the Third Estate is. We're the merchants, we're the bankers, we're the farmers, we're the lawyers, all right? We're the lawmakers, we're the tax collectors. We do everything that is needed to make a country. These guys, the top two estates, do nothing. So why are we letting them have any power? So what happens then in June is the delegates of the Estates General of the Third Estate, they say, whatever, let's make our own. They storm out, they go to a church, and they bang a gavel to create They create what new governing body? The National Assembly, all right? A more modern parliament that is elected by universal manhood suffrage. Now, only men can vote and only those who own property, but a big step in the right direction. There's no classifications for nobility or clergy. Everybody votes, all right? The next day, though, in order to stop this, the upper classes and the king put a lock on that church, and they go down the road to the tennis court where they sign an oath never to break up, okay? That's how the whole process starts. All those are key concepts, but we don't have space to write it all down. Carson, you can't just copy down the whole timeline and then not pay attention. That's how you get double quizzes tomorrow and the quiz after for Bell 6. My favorite bell. My favorite bell. Saved for all time. All right? Don't know what I was doing now. Totally off guard now. Nobody's going to do it. You're all going to get one. So, they create the National Assembly. Oh, if you want to compare that pamphlet, what is the third estate, to something in history, what would you compare it to? No, it is directly comparable to the American Revolution, specifically Common Sense by Thomas Paine. A guy writes a pamphlet that says, why are you fighting for representation in Parliament? Why are you fighting to listen to a divine right king? Just create your own country. So, the French people do. They create their own country. Now, since they are enlightened, liberal people, the ultimate goal of whatever government they create is going to be to do what? Protect the rights of the people. So before you can protect the rights, what do you have to do? Declare them. Bill of Rights is good. We see that in other countries. The Declaration of the Rights of Man. Put a big star by that. That is by far the single most enlightened document in European history. If you talk about the Enlightenment for that closing context, don't just say French Rev. Say the National Assembly made the Declaration of the Rights of Man. They were natural rights based off John Locke's that they would fight for, that everybody gets. So they create the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and then they create the Constitution of 1791. The Constitution of 1791 creates a constitutional monarchy, or a limited monarchy, where the king signs this document and agrees to follow these rules. He agrees to allow the National Assembly to meet no matter what. We understand all of that. One other big point that we should mention is that what do the liberals do with the Catholic Church?
They want to destroy it.
No. Okay? When I ask what did the radicals do with the Catholic Church, you're going to say they wanted to destroy it and get rid of it because they're radical. What the liberals did was they made all the clergy members sign something called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. The Civil Constitution of the Clergy. What the Civil Constitution of the Clergy did was it required all priests in France to swear that no matter what, they will follow the laws of France. Basically admitting that even though they are men of the Roman Catholic Church, since they live and work in France, they are not above the law. They will follow the laws, they will pay taxes, whatever else that they need to do. And let's write National Assembly under this Constitution too. So we have it on here somewhere. Next color. The second phase is the second or the radical phase. Again, use the second of your third and write second radical. See, France should have stopped here. The Constitution of 1791 is not a radical, crazy, liberal, democratic government. It is something that functionally can work in the late 1700s and well into the 1800s. Does anybody know what happened that screws it all up? Louis the 16th tries to.
Get foreign support to...
He calls up a conservative king. Do you remember who's the most conservative in Europe? Calls up the Habsburgs. Spain's a good guess, but they're too weak at this time, and says, hey, if I come to you, can I borrow your army, come back here and kill all these liberals and reestablish absolute monarchy? And the Habsburgs say yes. Why did the Habsburgs say yes to this?
Because they don't want it.
They don't want these liberal, crazy, hippie ideas of democracy and rights and natural rights to spread to their country. So the king tries to run away, but he's captured. And when he comes back, if you think of our political spectrum, right? Where are the liberals in the early stages of this revolution? They're all right here, okay? But they can't chop the king's committed treason. They can't chop his head off, right? What's the penalty for treason, though? Death. But they can't do it because they created a constitutional monarchy. What happens is, stuck between a rock and a hard place, a whole lot more people start throwing their support farther to the left. There's a couple names of the political parties over here. If you don't know them, write them down up here. Do you remember what they were? They were called the Jacobins. They were called the Jacobins. And then, within the Jacobins, there was an even more radical left group. They met at a really high point at the National Assembly. They were called the Mountain. And who was in charge of the Mountain? Robespierre. As these radicals take control of the National Assembly, They throw out the old constitution and create a new constitution without a king. So what's the first thing they do? What they promised to do. They behead Louis XVI, Louis the 16th. They chop the head, and this is the moment of the French Revolution that changes everything. Why is this moment so dramatic? Why is Louis the 16th king of France? God made him king. How many other countries of Europe have a king that God made them king? All of them. And here is France taking on the more radical side of the Enlightenment, saying, not only does he not have extreme power anymore, but he's dead. He's too dangerous. This is the moment when everybody on that map starts attacking France. And Robespierre is caught in a really tough situation because he has to constantly funnel money to the military. He has to draft. Remember the quote, all Frenchmen are now in permanent requisition for the service of the armies, right? Well, fighting a war, fighting a defense costs a lot of money, takes a lot of strife, takes a lot of trouble. People are starving and miserable. So to try to keep them in order, he eventually falls and falls and falls, more radical, and enacts the Reign of Terror. Reign of Terror. Do you remember the group that Robespierre was in charge of? He created this group to handle all defensive affairs. It's called the Committee of Public Safety. Now, the Committee of Public Safety, Reign of Terror, we understand all that. There's two other points. What does the radicals do with the church? Not only do they kick, there's a fancy word that's in the key concept. Close enough. It's called de-Christianization, or just de-Christianize. They strip all clergy of the right to do anything. They don't allow any churches. They actually confiscate church property and church wealth. They even change the calendar from our 12-month, 7-day a week to like a 5-month, 10-day a week, something like that. They de-Christianize, right? A more radical approach to all of it. And I do, besides Robespierre, want to mention his two sidekicks. Number one, his right-hand man was Danton. And the other guy, more famous to history because he spent most of his adult life where? In a bathtub. He had a skin condition, so he was the writer. He was the propaganda mister. His name was Jean-Paul Marat.
Was he the one killed in the bathtub?
Yes. Third phase, next color. The third phase, use whatever space you have left on the right, is called the third phase, or just the Napoleon phase. Napoleon takes over around 1800. Okay, now what's significant about Napoleon's rise to power? What do you remember about it? No, not divine right.
He's short.
What? Remember, he goes from consul to consul for life, to first consul, to emperor, right? Every step of the way, he's elected, okay? So he goes from consul to emperor. He earns his position. What's the best symbol that Napoleon earns his position of power? At his ceremony, where he is crowned emperor in Notre Dame, he takes the crown from the Pope's hands and crowns himself, telling the world, I earned this based on, remember the fancy word for Napoleon society? Merit, because he's going to create a meritocracy. Now, under Napoleon, he had a lot to deal with. Again, he still has all of Europe invading him, so the best defense in this situation is to do what? Offense. Go out there and kill all of them. If you're the best general in the history of Europe, then go ahead and kill them all. So military conflict, or military, conquest. And what is Napoleon and France's ultimate goal here? This is what terrifies the rest of Europe. This is what rallies the rest of Europe to stop Napoleon. Because his goal isn't to dominate and create one giant France that rules all of Europe. His goal is to do what? Spread Enlightenment ideals, or spread liberal revolutionary ideals. These hippie ideas like natural rights, democracy, we should elect our leaders. The one thing we don't mention much in this chapter, but it comes up later, is when Napoleon rolls into a place like the Germanic region, all the different Germanic city-states that are technically divided, and he beats them all up. Over time, what's their response to that? What's the response to getting your butt kicked together? You start to coagulate. We call that a nationalistic response. And we can't tell the story of 1871, of the creation and unification of Germany, without talking about Napoleon taking over that region. So, for Napoleon, we have two more things: the good reforms and the bad reforms. The good reforms under Napoleon, the one that comes up more often than anything, the thing that he's most significant for, is Napoleon created a new system of laws. A system of laws that everybody could read and applied to everybody the same, whether you were the elected king, a noble, a clergy member, or a peasant. Do you remember what that was called? Sometimes it's called the Napoleonic Code. They'll probably use the term civil code. It essentially abolishes the concept of nobility having special rules, special laws, special taxes. The other thing he did right, if he builds a meritocracy, right? What's the best? Meritocracy means the best people are going to earn the best positions. Well, if you want to build a real meritocracy, how do you make sure you find the best people? Education. Specifically, a public education, right? Not an education only for nobles or only for the clergy, but education available to all. The last thing he does right somewhere is, the last time we left the Roman Catholic Church, they were de-Christianized. He does get peace with the church. He does that by signing something called the Concordat of Bologna. What that did was it basically allowed the clergy back into France, but Napoleon got to appoint the priests and the bishops. So the church is allowed back in, but Napoleon gets some more power and influence. But then we have the bad of Napoleon. Okay? Napoleon was in some ways the first real dictator in European history, and he does some things that you now recognize having learned about other dictators. He was the first guy to introduce, if you want to become an absolute monarch, an absolute dictator, what do you need to control the population? You need a secret police. A secret police to control the population that are loyal to you. You need censorship. And also in the key concepts for Napoleon, you can just write women with a frowny face. Stick with me. Next color, we're going to go down to the bottom. You can pick any color you want. It doesn't really matter. Give me a little more than a third for this first one. Let's just put women and underline it. Now, there's a couple things with women in this area. They do participate heavily. They participate heavily in the French Revolution, mainly because of the Enlightenment. And where did women participate in the Enlightenment? Salons, very good. Leading discussions, guiding discussions. Where did they participate in the French Revolution? Do you remember the Women's March? Right? You can even argue Marie Antoinette. She was the villain. What was her famous quote? Let them eat cake. Very good. Okay. However, not however. Who are the famous women? There's two of them. Olympe de Gouges. And the British one, Mary Wollstonecraft. Olympe de Gouges, the French one, she wrote a pamphlet called The Declaration of the Rights of Women. Mary Wollstonecraft, the British one, she wrote a book called The Vindication of the Rights of Women, right? Both of them pro-women here. However, what is the part? Participated heavily in the French Rev. They make a special note of that. However, no citizenship. In this era where even the lower class citizens are starting to earn citizenship. And what's the most defining point of citizenship? Voting, right? Women don't earn this in France or in most countries in the early 1800s, which is why around 1850 a whole bunch of women get together in Seneca Falls and start first wave feminism, whose primary goal was suffrage or voting rights, and it ends about 1920. Some before, some after, because women earn the right to vote. Last guy, we'll put him down here again because they mentioned him twice. Just put Rousseau with the frowny face. He argues against women's role in society. Next line, we're almost there. There is one part controlled by France that the French revolutionary ideals do spread to for the detriment, and it hurts France. Do you remember what region of the world that is?
Colonies.
Yes, which one?
Haiti.
Haiti. Haiti, shut up. Haiti. The French name at the time, because they mentioned both, is Saint Dominique. The guy in charge of it just put his first name down. It's Toussaint Louverture. And he leads Saint Dominique to independence. The last box over here, the last thing, is the end of it all. Right? If we imagine our political spectrum, don't draw this. We imagine our political spectrum. The French Rev is mostly over here. Sometime it's over here. Napoleon's a little more moderate liberal, but he's still on the liberal side with meritocracy and education and voting and stuff like that. So what's Europe going to do? It's going to swing back. Is it going to swing back moderate? No, it's going to go way too far to the right. And they do that at the Congress of Vienna. This will be our next timeline, next one or the one after. But the Congress of Vienna, it is, what do they put? It is the conservative response. And their other goal, besides reestablishing conservative, the last thing we'll write down, is after France dominates all of Europe, they have to redraw the borders and restore the balance of power. You talked about the Concert of Europe and stuff. That is on the next timeline that has the Congress of Vienna. Thank you. That's it. I love you. Good night.